An Albanian murderer has shared a TikTok video from his British prison cell begging to be transferred to a jail in his home country so he can see his family and avoid the terrible food here. Ugat Merizat is reportedly posting on social media after being handed a 32-year sentence in May 2022 for the shotgun killing of a rival drug dealer. Now, using a mobile phone behind bars is illegal, but guards at HMP Manchester seem incapable of stopping the thug, who has even live-streamed himself playing online games for tokens that are being exchanged for cash. This is a British prison, and it's a man with a mobile phone. Why has he got a mobile phone? Why do you have a telephone when you're in prison? And he's recording videos. How's he got the Wi-Fi and a 5G plan with, you know, EE or BT or whatever they're called? How is this happening in 2025? I'm delighted to welcome David Shipley, a former prisoner, writer and researcher on prison and justice issues. David, welcome to the show.
Hi there.
David, thank you very much for joining us. Are you able to hear me okay? There was a look of hesitation in your eyes.
Yes, sorry, there was a little delay there.
Well, no, I'm delighted that you've joined us on the show. I don't expect prisons just to be, you know, a bare bed and a urinal and that's the end of it, because we would hope to rehabilitate folks so that when they leave prison, they can make a contribution to society, turn their life around. I'm all for that. But the idea that you've got access to a phone as a mass murderer and you're able to do TikTok videos strikes me as beyond the pale.
Well, it is, but it's so widespread. I mean, I think the reality that people need to understand is that mobile phones, smartphones, are trivially accessible in prison if you're prepared to pay for them. I think last year the MOJ announced they found over 10,000 phones. And what's worse is that actually this is against the law, but there are almost no prosecutions for possession of phones. No one's getting extra time on their sentences, really. People just get these phones seized. In some cases, I know those seized phones end up making their way back onto the wings because they've been sold or provided by staff. You know, the whole thing points to this moral corruption and collapse in the prison system.
Most definitely. And how do we fix it? Because the problem is that any talks of prison reform and toughening things up involves money, and the cupboard's bare. That's an issue, isn't it? Resource.
Well, look, the prison service is understaffed and under-resourced, and that's true. But actually, even if you provided it with all the money and staffing it needed, you would still have this moral corruption in the system. You would still have a leadership which doesn't want to make sure the rules are enforced, which doesn't really care about stopping drug taking, for example, because a huge amount of drug taking in prisons is allowed. You know, that doesn't really seem to care about stopping drone flights into prisons because they've essentially stopped serious efforts to interdict those drones and track them back to source. That's a leadership culture, and that's a choice. Yeah. And you don't have to have more money to decide to enforce the rules. You have to have the willpower to do it.
So you would suggest there's an issue with the culture in our jails and the management?
Absolutely, a leadership culture issue, yeah. You know, there are prisons all over the country where drone flights are known to be a huge issue, bringing in phones, bringing in drugs, sometimes bringing in weapons. And prison governors haven't even done the most basic things like putting up anti-drone netting, even months and months and months after they've been.
Why? Because that's a small and inexpensive measure.
It's a great question. I think the difficulty is sometimes it's very hard to distinguish between incompetence and malice when it's at this extreme. You know, either the leadership is entirely incompetent or they are maliciously trying to undermine good order in the prison system. But in any event, if they're not bothering to prosecute people for phone seizures, if they're not bothering to do basic anti-drone mechanisms, they're not really bothered about stopping drug taking at a significant scale, the harm done by that is huge. And that's the issue here. We need a leadership refresh, I would say. I think a lot of the leadership of HMPPS need to be replaced.
Which has parallels with the police service, wouldn't you say? Again, the issue we have with policing, yes, resource is a factor, but you know, the philosophy and the culture of modern policing leadership is, you know, these two issues run in parallel, and then you've got the judiciary.
Absolutely. I think the police, because they're a bit more visible, are probably not quite as bad as the prison service. Because prison is a secret place that exists behind walls, the scale of moral rot within it is less known, I think. And
Wow.
I'm writing a book about this at the moment, exploring, quite how lawless our prison system is.
So you would use the term moral rot. I mean, can you give me an example of moral rot within those institutions?
Yeah, I mean, it ranges from really simple stuff like the regularity with which prison officers will smell drugs being smoked in a cell and do nothing about it.
Right.
Because actually it's a lot of effort to go and open a cell door and confront someone and take their drugs off them. And if they are stoned on cannabis or on spice, they're probably not a problem. So that's an example of just taking the easy route. Similarly, prisoners who are a problem, who cause disorder, are often placated and effectively rewarded. When I was a prisoner, I remember seeing a man being given an Xbox because he was being destructive. It's almost sort of bad parenting, isn't it? If your toddler is kicking off and you give them sweets to get them to quieten down, what you're actually doing is teaching them that bad behavior is rewarded with sweets. And you see a lot of that culture in prison. And really, almost everyone in prison is there because they've broken society's rules. And we should have a prison system which teaches prisoners to follow the rules, like you said, to be rehabilitated, to change their lives, to be pro-social, not anti-social. And actually in prison, we see a system where the rules don't really matter. They're applied inconsistently. And in fact, prisoners learn the exact opposite lesson to what they should. So that's what I mean by moral rot, a system which just doesn't really care about the rules and the law.
Briefly, David, you spent time inside and you've since turned your life around and you're a best-selling author now with a new book on the way. If you had your magic wand, notwithstanding the financial constraints that the country currently faces and will likely face for the foreseeable, what would you do to make Britain's prisons more effective?
I think the first thing is to root out the moral corruption and the often actual criminal corruption as well. So that means we need to set up a sort of Elliot Ness style untouchable squad, probably part of the NCA, which would go into prisons targeting corruption all the way up to the leadership of HMPPS and really rooting it out. That it has to start there. We have to get organised crime and corruption out of our prison system.
David, thank you so much for your wisdom and insight on this issue. You've been there, you've got the T-shirt. My thanks to David Shipley, former prisoner, now best-selling author, writer and researcher on prison and justice issues, David Shipley. Next up, it's all about reform, because so many of you want change in this country and you feel that Nigel is your only hope.